powerful empire on earth. Yet within 6 weeks, they had Constantinople, the impregnable city that had never fallen, begging for mercy. This is how barbarians from the frozen north brought Rome to its knees. Picture this. June 18th, 860 AD. Fishermen casting their nets in the Bosporus spotted dragon-headed ships cutting through the dawn fog. Within hours, their peaceful morning would transform into a nightmare that would echo through centuries. By the end of this video, you'll understand how unknown Vikings nearly toppled history's greatest empire, why Rome's most elite soldiers failed, and the shocking aftermath that created the legendary Varangian Guard. Leading this apocalyptic fleet were two names that would haunt Byzantine nightmares: Askold and Dir, known in Kiev as Thunder and Lightning. These weren't random raiders. They commanded a force that had already crushed the mighty Khazars. But here's what doesn't add up. How did 5,000 men terrorize a city of 1 million? What made hardened Byzantine soldiers, veterans of countless battles, run in terror from these northern warriors? And why did Emperor Michael III, the man responsible for defending Christianity's greatest city, choose this exact moment to be hundreds of miles away, drunk in his palace? In the next few minutes, I'll reveal how Vikings reached Constantinople undetected, what secret weapon the Romans deployed that turned the sea into liquid fire, and why the Vikings suddenly withdrew when victory seemed within their grasp. Because what happened during those 6 weeks of terror wasn't just a raid, it was a collision of worlds that would reshape both empires forever. 22 servants were butchered in just 10 minutes at a single monastery. The suburbs of the world's richest city burned while its legendary walls stood helpless. But to understand how Vikings reached the heart of the Roman Empire, we need to go back to where this impossible story begins. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Ring the notification bell to never miss another story of courage, chaos, and conquest. Now, let me take you back to that terrifying morning of June 18th, 860 AD. Constantinople in 860 wasn't just any city, it was Rome reborn, the beating heart of Christian civilization. For over 1,000 years, these walls had never fallen. The Byzantine Empire, as historians call it, though its people simply called themselves Romans, controlled trade routes from Europe to Asia. Gold flowed through its markets like water. Silk, spices, and silver made it the richest city on earth. But the empire had a problem, and his name was Michael III. History remembers him as the drunkard, though that's being kind. While Viking longships prowled the Black Sea, the emperor was hundreds of miles away in Asia Minor, supposedly fighting Arab raiders. In reality, he spent more time with wine chalices than battle plans. His absence left a power vacuum in Constantinople that would cost thousands of lives. Now here's where it gets insane. The attackers weren't even proper Vikings, at least not anymore. The Rus, as the Byzantines called them, were Swedish Vikings, who had conquered Slavic tribes along the Dnieper River. Think of them as Vikings 2.0. They kept the legendary Norse fighting skills but added Slavic numbers and hunger for Byzantine gold. Their leaders, Askold and Dir, ruled from Kiev, a strategic stronghold that controlled the river route from Scandinavia to the Black Sea. The spark that lit this inferno? A trade dispute. Byzantine merchants had been squeezing Rus's traders, demanding higher taxes, restricting access to Constantinople's markets. For warriors who measured worth in silver and silk, this was an insult that demanded blood. But attacking Constantinople seemed impossible. The city's Theodosian walls stood 60 feet high and 20 feet thick. Triple defensive lines could hold off any army. The imperial fleet patrolled the waters with Greek fire, a weapon so terrifying that Vikings called it dragon's breath. Yet Michael's drunken campaigns had stripped the city's defenses. The elite Tagmata units, Constantinople's finest soldiers, were scattered across Anatolia. The imperial fleet pursued Arab pirates in the Mediterranean. Even worse, the massive chain boom that normally blocked the Golden Horn Harbour lay unmanned, its operators reassigned to other duties. The prefect, Nicetas Orifas, an experienced commander, suddenly found himself the last line of defense with barely 5,000 men, mostly ceremonial guards and militia. Intelligence networks that should have warned of approaching threats had grown lazy during years of peace. Nobody watched the Black Sea's northern approaches because nobody believed barbarians could organize a fleet capable of reaching Constantinople. This arrogance would cost them dearly. As spring turned to summer in 860, Askold and Dir assembled the largest Rus's fleet ever seen. 200 longships, each carrying 25 to 100 warriors, prepared for a journey that would either make them legends or corpses. On June 17th, Byzantine fishermen noticed strange sails on the horizon. They assumed it was a trading fleet. After all, who would dare attack the Queen of Cities? By dawn the next day, that assumption would turn the Bosporus red with blood. The Rus' fleet that descended upon Constantinople was a masterpiece of Viking naval engineering merged with Slavic ambition. 200 drukars, dragon ships, carved through the Black Sea in perfect formation. Each vessel was a weapon in itself. Shallow draft for river navigation, yet sturdy enough for open ocean, with the iconic dragon-head prow that struck terror into enemies' hearts. These ships could beach anywhere, turning any shoreline into a potential battlefield. Leading them was Askold, already legendary as the slayer of Khazars after crushing that steppe empire's river fortress. Warriors spoke of him cleaving through 3 men with a single axe swing. Beside him ruled Deer, known as the Silent Blade for his habit of killing without warning. Where Askold was rage and thunder, Deer was calculated death. Together, they commanded between 5,000 and 20,000 warriors. Chronicles differ, but even the lowest estimate meant catastrophe for Constantinople. But here's the detail historians don't want you to know. These weren't just raiders. Each longship carried specialists, axe-wielding huskars in mail hauberks, archers with composite bows stolen from steppe nomads, and most terrifying of all, berserkers. These warriors, dedicated to Odin, worked themselves into battle fury that made them immune to pain. Byzantine chronicles describe them biting their shields, howling like wolves, cutting down armored soldiers like wheat. The standard Rus warrior carried a 3-foot round shield, painted with symbols to terrify enemies. Their primary weapon, the Danish axe, 5 pounds of sharpened steel on a 4-foot handle that could split Byzantine armor like parchment. Secondary weapons included the Scramasax knife and pattern-welded swords worth more than most men earned in a lifetime. They wore their wealth: silver arm rings, golden Thor hammers, silk tunics taken from previous raids. Against them stood Constantinople's depleted garrison. 5,000 men sounds impressive until you realize most were skoutatoi, militia, equipped with outdated weapons and minimal training. The real defenders numbered fewer than 1,000. Palace guards in lamella armor, Scoli regiment, ceremonial troops forced into actual combat, and most crucially, the Greek fire operators. These technicians guarded the empire's most devastating secret, a flammable liquid that burned on water, impossible to extinguish, hot enough to melt iron. Then scouts reported something impossible. The Rus knew exactly where to strike. They bypassed the heavily fortified European shore, instead targeting the Asian suburbs where wealthy monasteries and merchant villas lay exposed. This intelligence suggested inside knowledge, perhaps from Rus merchants who'd studied the city's weaknesses during peaceful trading seasons. The geography itself became a weapon. The Bosporus Strait, normally Constantinople's protective moat, transformed into a highway of death. Only 15 miles long and less than a mile wide at its narrowest, it funneled attackers directly to the city's richest, least defended districts. The current that usually helped Byzantine ships now carried Viking raiders at terrifying speed. What they didn't know would cost thousands their lives. Prefect Nicetas Orifas had fought Rus's raiders before. He understood their tactics. Lightning strikes at dawn, psychological warfare through brutality, then withdrawal before organized resistance. But this wasn't a raid. This was an invasion fleet, prepared for extended siege. The sheer number of ships meant they could establish forward bases on the Prince's Islands, turning the Sea of Marmara into a Viking lake. The fatal oversight came down to bureaucracy. The harbour chain's maintenance crew had been reassigned to save money. The early warning beacon system hadn't been tested in years. Most damaging of all, the dromons, warships carrying Greek fire projectors, were scattered across the Mediterranean instead of guarding home waters. Constantinople's greatest strength, its assumption of invincibility, had become its greatest weakness. As dawn broke on June 18th, a fisherman named Theophilus became the first to spot dragon prows emerging from morning mist. His screams would begin 6 weeks of unprecedented terror. Within 1 hour, the suburbs would burn. Within 6 hours, the killing would begin. As dawn broke on June 18th, hell came to Constantinople. Dawn, June 18th, 860 AD. The first dragon prow cut through morning mist at exactly the moment Byzantine fishermen pulled up their nets. What followed next shocked even hardened warriors. The Rus's fleet moved in perfect synchronization, a wedge of death aimed straight at Constantinople's Asian suburbs. 200 ships materialized from the fog like an apocalyptic vision, their synchronized oar strokes creating a rhythm that witnesses compared to war drums. Theophilus the fisherman abandoned his nets and raced toward shore, screaming warnings that nobody believed. Vikings? Here? Impossible. By the time coastal villages accepted the truth, longships were already beaching. Warriors poured onto Byzantine soil like a plague of iron and death. Each ship discharged its cargo of killers with practiced efficiency, shields locked, axes ready, moving inland before defenders could organize. The race to close Constantinople's gates became a sprint against death. Prefect Nicetas or Rifus had perhaps 20 minutes warning. Guards ran through streets, bellowing for citizens to get inside the walls. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Women grabbed children and fled. The massive bronze gates, each weighing several tons, began their agonizing slow closure. Then the Vikings did something nobody expected. Instead of attacking the walls directly, they bypassed Constantinople entirely, striking the undefended suburbs where the empire's wealth lay exposed. The St. Mama's Quarter fell first. Rus's warriors smashed through villa gates, cutting down guards before they could draw swords. The Church of St. Irene, packed with mourning worshippers, became a slaughterhouse. Gold altar vessels disappeared into Viking sacks, while blood pooled on marble floors. Here's where legend meets horrifying reality. Patriarch Ignatius had sent 22 servants to prepare his suburban palace for a religious festival. They were arranging flowers when Vikings burst through the doors. What followed wasn't combat. It was systematic execution. One survivor, hidden beneath bodies, later testified that the killing took less than 10 minutes. Axes rose and fell with mechanical precision. The Russes didn't even loot until every Byzantine was dead. But Constantinople had a secret. As Vikings ravaged the suburbs, Greek fire crews prepared their weapons. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were technicians who guarded the empire's most classified military secret. The formula for Greek fire was so protected that operators swore death oaths. Even today, historians can't replicate it exactly. What we know: petroleum base, pine resin, sulfur, quicklime, heated to incredible temperatures, pumped through bronze tubes, creating liquid fire that water only spread. The first Greek fire deployment came at the 9th hour. A squadron of Viking ships approached the harbour, confident in their momentum. Then physics itself seemed to betray the Vikings. Streams of fire arced from the walls, turning the sea into an inferno. Longships became floating pyres. Warriors' mail armour became ovens. Men jumped into water seeking relief, only to find the sea itself burning. 30 ships, 1,500 men, incinerated in minutes. But wait, it gets worse. While Greek fire held the waterfront, Askold and Deir executed their true strategy. The Prince's Islands, scattered across the Sea of Marmara, fell one by one. These weren't military targets. They were pleasure resorts for Constantinople's elite, packed with treasures and defenseless. Nuns at the Monastery of the Holy Trinity watched Vikings beach their ships, then barricaded themselves in the chapel. The Vikings simply set the building on fire. In that moment, Rome's thousand-year confidence shattered. Citizens packed onto the walls could see smoke rising from 9 different islands. The psychological impact was devastating. If Vikings could strike anywhere, appear from nowhere, what good were walls? Panic spread faster than Greek fire. Rumors claimed Askold commanded demons, that Deir could become invisible, that pagan gods had abandoned Christ's city. Nicetas organized what defense he could with his skeleton garrison. Archers lined the walls. Greek fire projectors were wheeled into position. The harbour chain, finally, was raised and manned. But defending 12 miles of walls with 5,000 men against an enemy that could strike anywhere was like trying to hold water in a sieve. Then scouts reported something that made even veterans pale. The Vikings weren't just raiding. They were establishing camps, bringing up supplies, preparing for extended operations. Nobody expected what came through those gates next. Refugees flooded into Constantinople with tales that grew worse by the hour. Entire villages burned, monks crucified on their own church doors, children taken as slaves. The suburban population, perhaps 200,000 people, faced apocalypse while the city watched helplessly. Some citizens demanded sorties to save their relatives. Nicetas refused. Opening the gates meant inviting massacre. As darkness fell on June 18th, Constantinople's suburbs glowed with flames. From the walls, Citizens could hear screams carrying across water. Viking war chants echoed off ancient stones. The Rus had achieved in one day what Arab armies couldn't in centuries. They'd made Constantinople afraid. Then began 6 weeks of pure terror. Week 1 erupted in systematic destruction that would haunt Byzantine memory forever. The Vikings operated from their island bases with ruthless efficiency, launching daily raids that turned the Sea of Marmara into their personal hunting ground. Each dawn brought fresh horror. Longships would emerge from hidden anchorages, strike a different stretch of coast, then vanish before defenders could respond. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to break Constantinople's will. The monastery of St. John Studius fell on the 3rd day. 40 monks had refused evacuation, trusting in God's protection. Viking axes provided a different answer. The monastery's legendary library, containing irreplaceable texts from antiquity, became kindling. Gold-leafed gospels disappeared into Rus's ships. The lead from the roof was stripped and melted down for trade. What the Vikings couldn't carry, they burned. But then Greek fire struck back with devastating effect. A Rus flotilla of 50 ships attempted to probe the Golden Horn defenses. Overconfident from easy victories, they approached in broad daylight. Greek fire operators had spent 3 days preparing this trap. When Vikings entered range, hell itself erupted. Pressurized siphons launched streams of liquid fire that turned the strait into an inferno. The screams of burning warriors carried to both shores. Longships became floating crematories. The lucky ones died instantly. Others, their clothes and hair aflame, leaped into water that offered no escape. Greek fire burned on the surface, turning rescue into death. 30-plus longships incinerated in that single engagement. Perhaps 2,000 Rus's warriors died in 20 minutes. Byzantine citizens cheered from the walls as Viking raiders learned that Constantinople's legendary weapon was no myth. The burning wrecks drifted with the current, some still containing charred corpses fused to their benches by intense heat. It seemed like victory. It wasn't. What happened next defied all military logic. Instead of withdrawing after such losses, Askold and Deer intensified their attacks. But now they adapted. Vikings struck at night, using darkness to mask their movements. They learned Greek fire's limitations. The weapon had barely 50-meter range and couldn't track fast-moving targets. Raiders developed hit-and-run tactics that minimized exposure. Most cunningly, they used captured fishing boats as decoys, forcing defenders to waste precious Greek fire on empty vessels. Weeks 2 and 3 brought stalemate wrapped in atrocity. Vikings systematically stripped the Asian suburbs of wealth, while Constantinople watched helplessly. The pattern was always the same: dawn raids on undefended settlements, systematic looting, then withdrawal before Byzantine forces could respond. But this is where the story takes a blood-soaked turn. The Rus weren't just stealing, they were harvesting. Slave columns grew daily. Young Byzantines, chained together, stumbled toward longships that would carry them to Kiev's slave markets. Individual moments of heroism punctuated the horror. When Vikings demanded entry to the fortified monastery of Saints Sergius and Bacchus, the monk Theodosius challenged their champion to single combat. Armed only with a pilgrim's staff against a Danish axe, he lasted 12 seconds. But those 12 seconds allowed children to escape through back passages. The Vikings honored his courage by granting the survivors safe passage. After looting everything valuable, Rus's warriors probed Constantinople's land walls nightly, testing for weaknesses. Grappling hooks clattered against stone. Scaling ladders appeared from darkness. Each probe was repulsed, but defenders knew they were being studied. Deer personally led reconnaissance missions, his warriors mapping every tower, every gate, memorizing guard rotation patterns. The Vikings were learning, adapting, preparing for something bigger. Then came the moment nobody saw coming. Michael III's location remained unknown. Some claimed he was dead. Others insisted he was marching to relieve the city. The truth was worse. The emperor was alive, but paralyzed by indecision. His forces scattered across Anatolia, unwilling to abandon Asian territories to Arab raiders. Constantinople was on its own. Week 4 brought desperation to both sides. Food supplies in the suburbs had been exhausted. Vikings turned to increasingly distant raids, each requiring more effort for less reward. Disease began spreading in their packed island camps: dysentery from poor sanitation, infected wounds from Greek fire burns. Byzantine defenders faced their own crisis. Ammunition for Greek fire projectors was running low. The secret weapon that had saved them required rare ingredients. impossible to replenish under siege. Here's the detail historians don't want you to know. Negotiations began secretly. Byzantine merchants, facing economic ruin, sent messages to Askold through Rus's traders. Terms were discussed. Withdrawal in exchange for massive tribute. Gold, silver, silk, enough to make every Viking warrior wealthy. Dur seemed interested. Askold wanted more blood. The Rus's leadership split between pragmatism and revenge, but fate had a twisted sense of humor waiting. Patriarch Photios, Constantinople's religious leader, delivered his famous Thunderbolt from Heaven sermon on July 23rd. Standing in the Hagia Sophia before thousands of terrified citizens, he proclaimed the Viking invasion as God's punishment for Byzantine sins. Only divine intervention could save them. The city must repent, fast, pray. Most importantly, they must display Christianity's most sacred relic. Week 5 witnessed either miracle or masterful psychological warfare. The Theotokos, the Virgin Mary's robe, was Constantinople's most precious relic, normally hidden in the Blakeney Palace Chapel. On August 2nd, Patriarch Photios led a procession around the walls. Citizens wept as the sacred garment passed. Veterans who'd fought Arabs and Bulgars knelt in prayer. Even cynics felt something changing. Storm clouds, absent all summer, began gathering. What followed breaks every rule of warfare. As the relic procession reached the seawalls, wind began rising. Waves that had been calm for weeks turned violent. Viking longships, built for rivers and coasts, struggled in suddenly choppy seas. Then came rain. Not gentle drops, but sheets of water that reduced visibility to nothing. Several Rus's ships, attempting to maintain station, were driven onto rocks. But the real terror was just beginning. Byzantine chroniclers describe what happened next in apocalyptic terms. Lightning struck Viking camps. Hail the size of pigeon eggs pelted warriors. The temperature, sweltering all summer, plunged. Rus warriors, mostly unprotected from elements, faced a Mediterranean storm of unprecedented fury. Was it divine intervention? Coincidence? Or had Byzantine weather observers, noting atmospheric changes, timed the relic procession perfectly? Here's where sources diverge wildly. Byzantine writers claim Vikings fled in terror, abandoning their camps. Rus's chronicles suggest a negotiated withdrawal. Ships heavy with tribute, holds packed with slaves and silver. Arab historians, neutral observers, report elements of both. A storm that convinced superstitious Vikings their gods had abandoned them, combined with Byzantine eagerness to pay any price for peace. Then something happened that changed history. On August 4th, Askold gave the withdrawal order, but this wasn't panicked flight. Rus's ships left in formation, loaded with enough plunder to fund kingdoms. Byzantine officials, desperate to claim victory, didn't interfere. As the last longship disappeared into morning mist, Constantinople celebrated deliverance. They didn't know the real shock was coming. August 4th, 860, the last dragon-proud ship vanished into Black Sea mist, leaving behind smoking ruins and traumatized survivors. Constantinople's church bells rang in celebration, but the sound echoed hollow across devastated suburbs. What remained after 6 weeks of Viking fury defied comprehension. Where thriving communities once stood, only charred foundations remained. The death toll, though disputed, numbered in thousands, mostly civilians caught outside the walls during those first terrible hours. But wait, it gets worse. As citizens emerged to survey damage, the true scope of catastrophe became clear. The Asian suburbs, home to perhaps 200,000 people, had effectively ceased to exist. 9 major monasteries lay in ruins. Countless churches, their gold stripped, their priests murdered, stood as blackened shells. The economic infrastructure that fed Constantinople, farms, mills, workshops, had been systematically destroyed. Entire bloodlines ended in Viking slave ships heading north. Askold and Dur returned to Kiev as heroes beyond measure. Their ships groaned under plunder weight. Byzantine gold, silver chalices, silk worth fortunes, and most valuable of all, thousands of slaves for eastern markets. Warriors who'd left as raiders returned as wealthy men. Silver arm rings were distributed according to battle merit. Dur personally rewarded the Greek fire survivors with extra shares. The message spread across the Viking world. Constantinople could bleed. This detail will haunt your dreams. Byzantine damage assessment revealed the strategic brilliance of Viking targeting. They hadn't struck randomly. Every destroyed site had economic or religious significance. Monasteries weren't just wealthy, they were agricultural centers that fed the city. Suburban villas weren't just homes, they were administrative centers for imperial estates. In 6 weeks, Vikings had inflicted damage that would take decades to repair. Nicetas Orifas emerged from the siege as either hero or lucky survivor, depending on perspective. He'd saved Constantinople itself, preventing Vikings from breaching the walls, but he'd also watched helplessly as suburbs burned. Emperor Michael III, finally returning in late August, found his capital economically crippled and psychologically shattered. The prefect's reward? Blame for allowing barbarians to humble Rome's successor. Michael's rage manifested in immediate reforms that would reshape Byzantine military doctrine forever. The intelligence failure that allowed 200 ships to approach undetected resulted in mass executions of negligent officials. Coastal watch stations were established every 5 miles along the Bosporus. The droneman's fleet was recalled from Mediterranean adventures to patrol home waters. Most significantly, negotiations began for something unprecedented: hiring Vikings as mercenaries. Here's what most people miss. The siege's immediate aftermath proved almost as devastating as the raid itself. Refugees flooded Constantinople, straining resources. Food prices tripled. Disease spread in overcrowded quarters. Worse, the psychological damage proved lasting. Citizens who'd believed their city invincible now jumped at every unfamiliar sail. The nightmare of dragon ships haunted Byzantine dreams. Survivor accounts, collected by monastery scribes, paint visceral pictures of Viking brutality. Their axes split skulls like overripe melons, one witness testified. They showed no mercy to age or sanctity. I saw them use a priest's own crozier to beat him to death. Another survivor, a merchant's widow, described hiding in a wine cellar for 3 days, listening to Vikings systematically loot her home above, praying they wouldn't find the hidden entrance. Patriarch Photios interpreted the miraculous storm as divine approval of Byzantine repentance. His victory sermons, delivered to packed churches, claimed God had struck down pagan invaders. But theological triumph couldn't hide practical reality. Constantinople had survived through luck, weather, and Viking pragmatism, not military might. The storm had provided face-saving exit for both sides. Vikings could claim supernatural opposition, Byzantines could claim divine protection. Nobody talks about what happened after dark during those first days after Viking withdrawal. Byzantine soldiers, frustrated by their impotence during the siege, took revenge on suspected collaborators. Rus's merchants, trapped in Constantinople when their kinsmen attacked, faced mob violence. Several were burned alive by crowds screaming "barbarian lovers." The emperor, needing someone to blame besides himself, did nothing to stop these pogroms. But divine intervention has a price. The miracle that saved Constantinople created dangerous precedent. Future emperors would rely on divine favor rather than military preparation. The Theotokos procession became mandatory response to threats, sometimes replacing practical defense. This faith-based strategy would have catastrophic consequences when Vikings returned, and they would return. Year 861 brought immediate vindication of Byzantine fears. Danish Vikings, learning of Askold's success, probed the same route. Though smaller in scale, merely 20 ships, they found Byzantine defenses transformed. Greek fire stations lined the Bosporus. Patrol ships intercepted them in the Black Sea. The Danes withdrew after losing 3 ships, but the message was clear. The northern route to Constantinople was now known to every ambitious Viking chief. What followed changed medieval warfare forever. Secret negotiations between Byzantine diplomats and Rus's leaders intensified. The empire needed northern warriors. The Ruses wanted Byzantine gold and trade privileges. From this unlikely partnership would emerge one of history's most elite military units. But that transformation lay decades in the future. In 861, Constantinople simply struggled to rebuild, while Vikings countered their unprecedented plunder. But the real terror was just beginning. Askold and Deir's success inspired imitators. Viking raids would return in 907, 941, and 1043, each building on lessons learned during those 6 weeks of hell. The age of Byzantine invincibility had ended. The Vikings had proven that with enough ships, enough warriors, and enough audacity, even the Eternal City could be brought to its knees. The 860 siege birthed a transformation neither empire could have predicted. Those 6 weeks of terror established Rus' military credibility forever. No longer dismissed as mere raiders, they'd proven capable of threatening civilization's greatest city. Future negotiations between Constantinople and Kiev carried the unspoken weight of those dragon ships emerging from morning mist. Byzantine diplomats who'd once sneered at barbarians now offered treaties written in golden ink. History pivoted on what happened next.